Sweatshirt with the set-in sleeves is easily made using ribbing for the neck opening and the lower edge. It's got a lovely kangaroo pocket on the front and top stitching it with twin needle. Pattern pieces you need: front on a fold, back on a fold, pocket times 1 on a straight grain but on a fold, and sleeve 2 on the straight grain. Cutting out the fabric for the sweatshirt. The front and the back are both cut on the fold, so lay them out and pin them down and cut them closely to the pattern edge, especially on the curves, and make sure you put your marks in for the front and the back on the armhole edges and centre front and back. Sleeve is cut on the straight grain, cutting out 2, cut it up to the pattern, especially along the sleeve head, and make sure you have the front, back and shoulder markings on the sleeve head to match up with the shirt body. Now we're going to cut out one pocket on the fold on the straight grain. Make sure you cut in precisely on all the notches, and you can mark centre front at the top of the bottom. And we're going to cut out ribbing for the sleeve, about 6 to 8 centimetres wide, and ribbing for the neck, about 5 to 6 centimetres wide. The pocket. First thing we need to do is fold 1 centimetre of the angled pocket opening to the wrong side and pin from the right side. We're going to top stitch this in place. I've used twin needle whenever I've done this because it zigzags it underneath so it doesn't fray. You can obviously use the straight stitch as well. So we're going to sew this, make sure you back stitch to begin with, sew your seam and back stitch at the end. Do this for both sides, and if you've done the twin needle you need to trim away the excess fabric. And to help you line up for the pocket, mark the centre of the front at the waist level and the centre of the front of the pocket. Going to press the back of the pocket, press those nice folded lines, and what we're now doing is folding over 1 centimetre at the top of the pocket and pressing it, and we're going to do the same with the sides. Fold in 1 centimetre at the sides and press it both sides, and that way our pinning is just to attach the pocket to the sweatshirt. So make sure you've got a halfway mark for the bottom of the pocket. And what you're going to do is you're going to have that pinned to the sweatshirt. You don't fold it over because that's going to be joined into the waistband when you attach the ribbing. So we're going to match those. Another good way is to actually press the centre of your front to get your markings. Otherwise, get out your pattern piece with the pocket placement lines and use that. So pin it in place, and I use the twin needle and I start at the right side of the sweatshirt and top stitch up the first side. Remember to use your back stitch to secure your seam, and once you've done that first side, lift the foot of your sewing machine up and push your fabric through and get to the beginning of the top of the pocket, and back stitch to start, go across the front and back stitch at the end. You'll have a zigzag stitch underneath on the wrong side, but nobody will see that. The good thing about the twin needle is it's definitely 4mm apart and it's a straight line, whereas if you try and do 2 lines with 1 needle and you go back, you usually have a bit of a wiggle in the middle and not quite so straight. So finish that, trim your threads, and you can press your pocket from the wrong side. Shoulder seams. With the right side facing, we're going to pin the front shoulders to the back shoulders on both sides. And we have the pins pointing towards the neck because we're going to sew from the neck down to the armhole seam. Using zigzag, 3mm in length, 3mm in width. We're going to backstitch to begin our seam and backstitch to finish our seam to secure it. And when you've done both sides, press both shoulders towards the back pattern piece. Neck opening. Right, we are needing to quarterize our neck, which means we put a pin in at the centre front and the centre back, and then we find the halfway point between the centre front and centre back, and that becomes another quarter, and we put a pin on both sides for that. Now this makes our neck into quarters. Now we're going to do the same with the ribbing, but to find out the right amount of ribbing we need, we're going to place our ribbing from one pin to another, which is 1/4 of the distance, and we're going to multiply that by 3. So we're getting 3/4 of the ribbing to the full size of the neck, and we add another 2 centimetres for seam allowance. Now to sew this ribbing together, we're going to make a circle out of it, a 1 centimetre seam, and I use straight stitch so you don't have a bubbly edge. Now we fold this lengthwise, flatten out the seam, fold your ribbing all the way around lengthwise and put a pin in at the centre back, which is where your seam is, and you're going to line that up with the centre back of the sweatshirt. Fold your ribbing in half to find the centre front and put a pin there, and then you're going to divide the ribbing into 4, just as we did for the front. So we're all ready to pin it. Starting with the centre back, we pin that in place and work around to the centre front and make sure we've pinned at both sides. So you're matching all the pins all the way around, and once you've done that you pin in between. The only thing we're going to stretch when we sew is the ribbing. We won't stretch the sweatshirting. So we're pinning it in place, and then we'll be all ready to sew it. Here it is all pinned. Doesn't look like very many pins, probably because it was only about a 12-month size. We fit it over the arm of the sewing machine, and we're going to attach the ribbing to the neck with zigzag stitch. Back stitch at the beginning and the end of your seam to fasten it. And you can either choose to clip the seam at the end or not, and you can also choose to top stitch that seam down or not. I like to use twin needle if I decide to do that. And then we press the seam towards the body of the sweatshirt on the wrong side. Armhole seam. With the right sides facing, we're going to match a sleeve pattern piece to the sweatshirt body at the armhole, and we're going to match the front and the back markings. That way it tells you whether or not you've got the wrong side facing. If the sleeve's too big for the hole, just do a stay stitch line to gather it up just slightly. So I usually pin the shoulder first, the front marking or the back marking, and then the side seams, and then pin in between. It's best to have the most pins that you can get in. It just helps you to line up as you sew. Otherwise, if you've got a big gaping hole, that's when you can get errors, and you might happen to sew a 1 centimetre seam allowance on the top piece, but underneath it's only 1/2 centimetre, which can put your shirt out of shape. Not hugely, but it doesn't look that good. Right, so we're all pinned up. And ready to sew. So again, we're sewing this with zigzag seam, back stitch to begin with. Slowly go around because we've got this curved seam. Make sure the body of the shirt is out of the way so that we don't get any tucks and errors in our sewing. And back stitch when you're finished. And clip the seam on the curved parts every 1 to 2 centimetres to make sure it falls nicely and fits well. Make sure you use your sharp dressmaker's scissors to do this and don't cut through the seam. And we're going to press the seam towards the sleeve, and then we have to repeat the whole process with the other sleeve, and we're getting very close to having an almost finished sweatshirt. Side seams. We're going to fit our body and sleeve together at the sides. First place I always pin is the armhole seam. I line it up so both seams are within millimetres of each other. Pin the lower edge and pin the sleeve cuff, and then pin in between. More pins you put in the better, and that way you don't have any fabric moving out as you sew. We sew from the lower edge up towards the armhole seam and to the cuff. That way you sew the armhole seam in the direction that you have already pressed it in. Zigzag seam, back stitch to begin with. Go slowly over the armhole seam and back stitch when you finish at the sleeve cuff. Repeat to do the other side, and we're going to press the seam towards the back of the sweatshirt, and I use a simple piece of cardboard, corrugated cardboard, which I slip inside a long sleeve to help have something solid behind it when I'm pressing towards the back with the side seam as well. So, and you try not to press a seam into the sleeve. Right, hems. First hem we're going to do is the cuff, the sleeve hem, and it's very much the same as the neck. We have to cauterize the cuff, it's much smaller, and find 3/4 of that length for a piece of ribbon. Sew it together as we did with the neck, fold it over, and also make that into quarters as well. Now the cuffs are quite fiddly, very small. You need to take your time when sewing them and lift the fabric out. Make sure you don't have 2 or 3 layers of the sweatshirting or the previous sewing that you've just done on that cuff stuck in the back. So fold your ribbon over. We're going to attach this to the outside of the sleeve, so the right side of the sleeve, and we're going to match up all the 4 pins, pin it together. You may well only get 4 pins around a sleeve cuff, very tiny little area. All the cuffs on most of the t-shirts are quite small. Just take your time to sew them. So place it in there and zigzag seam, back stitch to begin with, back stitch to finish. Notice how tightly curved round the whole seam is, and you just need to take your time, work it around, move it around, and do the same for the other sleeve. If you don't have ribbing, you can just have a longer sleeve, or if you don't want to have a cuff like this, you could do it like bias binding with the ribbon. Lower edge hem. We're doing the same as we did for the neck, cauterising the waist, 3/4 of that circumference for the ribbing plus 2 centimetres for a seam. We're incorporating the pocket so it's quite thick at the front, so we need to take our time when we sew this. Straight stitch to join your ribbing together. Trim your threads so you haven't got threads all over the place. I tend to put this at the centre back so you don't have the bulk at a seam. Some people don't want to do that because they don't want to see that seam look. It just means it's less bulky on a seam when you sew. Certainly don't put it at the centre front, that would look odd. So again, we cauterise our rib and pin it in place. Now if you don't have ribbing, you can actually make your front much longer, and actually you need to include that length in the pocket, the bottom of the pocket, and you can just fold it over like a normal hem, or you could actually put buttonholes in it and throw in a drawstring. That looks very good. So we're all set, ready to sew. Use as many pins as you possibly can. Zigzag stitch to sew the seam, back stitch to begin and back stitch to end. Take your time, especially around the front where the pocket is quite bulky and thick. When you're finished, trim your threads and press your waist seam towards the body of the shirt, and same with the cuffs, press those towards the sleeve.